Hey, this is Martha DeGrasse here for the Wi-Fi Alliance and the Signal Podcast, and we have a treat for you in our podcast feed today. Kevin Robinson, President and CEO of the Wi-Fi Alliance, was recently featured on the policytracker Spectrum podcast hosted by Richard Haas. Kevin and Richard discussed the recent Big Beautiful Bill and its mandates to the FCC to auction 800 megahertz of spectrum. Hope you enjoy this episode, and don't forget to rate and review The Signal in your favorite podcast app. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the policytracker Spectrum podcast. My name is Richard Haas, and I'm an analyst and a journalist here at policytracker. On the 4th of July, the US President Donald Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act into law. At over 1,000 pages long, the bill is a vast document. But for us in spectrum management, there was one particular section that piqued our interest. On page 287, there's a section titled Identification and Auction of Spectrum. This section gives the FCC back its power to conduct spectrum auctions and also instructs it to find 800 megahertz of spectrum for mobile/5G. But what the bill doesn't say is where specifically this spectrum should come from. This sort of leaves the agencies, specifically the FCC and the NTIA, in a tough spot, with targets to hit but no clear guidance on what spectrum exactly should be repurposed. The bill does include exemptions from some certain federal bans, but there's no explicit protections for Wi-Fi or CBRS users. Today I'll be speaking to Kevin Robinson, who is the President and CEO of the Wi-Fi Alliance, about this to get a perspective from the Wi-Fi industry. Hi, Kevin. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Richard. It's great to be with you.
I'm curious, what do you feel the risk is of this bill for the Wi-Fi industry? How real do you see that risk being?
Sure, Richard. So I think it's important to kind of put all this in perspective, right? So it's a non-zero risk, and it's certainly something that the Wi-Fi industry needs to be paying attention to. But I think some of the risk is being elevated maybe a little bit beyond what it is in actuality. And as you kind of went through some of the specific provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill, as you mentioned, there's at least 800 megahertz that needs to be auctioned off. That needs to come from somewhere between, roughly 1 to 10 gigahertz, right? So we're talking about a pretty wide swath of spectrum where the FCC can find this spectrum for auction. And there's a few pieces of it that really we know already will not impact Wi-Fi. So as an example, there's 500 megahertz that needs to come from federal users. So automatically 500 of the 800, that's not going to apply to any band that the Wi-Fi is in. In addition, there's another 100 megahertz, at least 100 megahertz, and it could be a little bit more, but 100 megahertz that needs to come from 3.9 to 4.2. So again, not likely, in fact, not only not likely, but it is not going to impact Wi-Fi. So what we're really talking about is 200 megahertz, possibly a little bit less, depending on, where that other 100, whether it can be 100, 150, et cetera. But 200 or less that has to come from federal, non-federal, or both. So this could be a combination of federal or commercial users. And that's really kind of the universe of what is creating this potential risk for Wi-Fi. Now, what's also interesting is when you actually look at the bands that the legislation asks the FCC to study, none of those are the 6 gigahertz band, right? So it's in 2.7 to 2.9, 4.4 to 4.9, 7.25 to 7.4. That's where they want studies to happen. So while you're absolutely correct that it does not call out or does not give specific direction on where the FCC should find the spectrum, Wi-Fi, I think, is in a pretty good position in terms of us not likely to be the first place people go looking for that spectrum. And there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, we know that when the initial language for this bill was coming through the U.S. House of Representatives, there was a specific exemption saying do not touch the 6 gigahertz band, which Wi-Fi is using. While that didn't ultimately make it into the final bill, we know that there are strong supporters in Congress that really recognize the significant value that Wi-Fi in the 6 gigahertz band is already delivering today. In fact, we've seen statements even from the administration saying about the importance of 5G, 6G, and Wi-Fi for the future of connectivity in the U.S. So again, we think that based on the benefits that we bring, there are better opportunities to find that 200 megahertz of spectrum than going into the 6 gigahertz band.
Right. So the risk is there, but it's maybe not existential.
It's probably not likely. Now, when you talk about existential, it's something different in that if it does materialize, I think you do actually have some significant impacts on Wi-Fi today and especially into the future, because the 6 gigahertz band is kind of the foundation of the future generations of Wi-Fi. Starting with our current generation Wi-Fi 7, it was built from the ground up to take advantage of this additional spectrum. So it's existential, but highly unlikely at this point that ultimately it will materialize.
You brought up that the original House bill, it did include a specific protection for Wi-Fi. Was it disappointing to see that language removed? And do you have any idea why it may have been removed?
It's hard to speculate on kind of how the sausage gets made, if you will, in Washington, D.C. So I'll probably avoid that. It's a process of trying to get to consensus. I think that the current language, given that there are many stakeholders in these bands from 1 to 10 gigahertz, it might have been more palatable just to have as few carve-outs as possible. And the carve-outs you do see, I think, as you mentioned, Richard, are things that are specifically around national security, defense, military spectrum. Right. So that can kind of make sense that those are the carve-outs, but just limiting any additional carve-outs. The Wi-Fi industry, we feel we're in a good position, just given that we can demonstrate real benefit in terms of what we're delivering today and into the future. But who knows ultimately what happened in the conversations? But my suspicion is it's something of just not trying to get into the back and forth of too many carve-outs, which just are pitting various stakeholders against each other too early in the process.
Yeah. I don't think anyone knows really how this particular sausage got made. We, in trying to write about it, saw so many different versions of the text. And we just decided in the end, we'll just wait until it's signed, and then we sort of will know what's in it. But yeah, it did change a lot, and some things sort of aren't easy to understand why. If there was a worst case scenario and the FCC said, look, we're going to try to get 200 megahertz from upper 6, would it even be possible to reassign the band? It's been out there for a few years now. There's people out there using it. There's routers transmitting in it. Would it technically even be possible to sort of revert that decision?
That's a very interesting question, because we are talking about unlicensed bands, and we're talking about enterprise devices, but a lot of consumer devices, right? So you have the challenges. Okay, so let's maybe take a step back and talk about how many devices are really out there. So there's more than 5,000 different individual models of product that have 6 gigahertz in them that are shipping. So that's your flagship smartphones. It's most business laptops that are coming out, have come out in the last several years. Enterprise networks, increasingly home routers, gateways, etc. And yes, some of those are managed, if you will, by entities like service providers that likely could do something like roll out firmware updates and disable those specific frequencies. But then you also have smartphones, and that poses a challenge. Like, how many people update consistently their smartphone? And so, yes, there are absolutely risks that even if they did pull the spectrum back, there are going to be a number of devices out there that ultimately don't get an update and maybe are operating in the band, which would certainly be unfortunate. Now, the industry will do everything it can to do the right thing, but that's just the reality of consumer devices. It's kind of difficult to always control every single device out there. So that kind of gets to let's say the challenges of doing it. Then there's also the wisdom of doing it, right? What type of what signals does that send to an industry that has invested significant amount of money developing 6 gigahertz gear? And has really kind of bet product lines and new use cases on the access to the spectrum to then take it back so soon after it was granted, right? That's going to create huge uncertainty in the market and in other industries as well, because it starts setting a precedent, right? So I think that gets more to the wisdom of doing something like this. And then finally, as we've already alluded to, there's just the economic impact and the impact to use cases that people are relying on today. You talk about gaming routers that need very low latencies, relying on 6 gigahertz to deliver that. Okay, well, that use case now starts getting impacted. You talk about augmented reality or virtual reality, where you might be tethering that headset to either a gaming console or to a smartphone in your pocket. That's happening over unlicensed 6 gigahertz. That now gets negatively impacted. And then I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit when we talk about kind of what's happening in Europe. But most of where you immediately need this spectrum is in more of those dense areas, urban areas or dense deployments like apartments. And the lack of the spectrum in those environments or in the enterprise, in companies that rely on this every single day for their basic operations, right? The engine of our economy, those are going to be negatively impacted as well. So I think there's practical challenges in making it happen, as you allude to, and then there is the wisdom, is it wise to then do that because of the uncertainty it creates in industry and what it ultimately undermines in terms of productivity and economic benefit.
Mm-hmm. I guess what would you, if you were the FCC and you were tasked with finding 200 megahertz, what would be your approach? Obviously, you wouldn't go after upper 6. But what do you hope their strategy will be?
So I think that they are, without naming specific bands, and ultimately with the alliance, we may end up having some recommendations on where they might better find the spectrum. But probably a couple things that I suspect the FCC is considering. One, the incumbent situation is a very big consideration. And this is one of the reasons why we say actually 6 gigahertz is not a great option, because if you're going to deploy full power INT into the band, you're going to face challenge. You need to move incumbents. That's the nice thing with Wi-Fi is we can coexist. The incumbents never had to move out of 6 gigahertz band. That is not the case with IMT. So like any spectrum clearing effort, who is going to be impacted is a huge consideration. The other piece is likely looking lower in spectrum, just because of propagation characteristics. If they're doing wide area mobile broadband or maybe even fixed wireless access, they want better propagation characteristics than 6 gigahertz, and that means moving lower down in the spectrum. So that's going to be a key piece. Particularly if you're looking at anything that needs to go through building walls. One of the main challenges also with 6 gigahertz and just in general trying to serve indoor connectivity from outside is problematic in 6 gigahertz. So I think that's going to be a significant consideration as well. So, in general, I think, lower in the band is likely where they're going to be looking for this. We already know that they cannot impact some of these key federal users, Department of Defense users in the exempted bands. But we do think there are certainly additional opportunities below 6 that would actually be a win-win, because Wi-Fi still gets to operate in 6. The mobile operators get better spectrum for their use cases. And that ultimately is going to benefit the economy. Because a point we often make, what often comes up in these, it becomes almost like an adversarial thing, but Wi-Fi and cellular are very strong complements to one another. So, for the Wi-Fi industry, we want cellular to have very high performance, because it's this symbiotic relationship where many of the use cases and applications are going to have to span both cellular and Wi-Fi. And you need high performance in both. And so we certainly hope that they're able to find spectrum somewhere else, because that ultimately will drive enhanced connectivity and both industries will benefit.
Yeah, you make a good point about the incumbents as well. I think sometimes we think about 6 gigahertz as just being sort of an empty band. Obviously, there's all those fixed links in there. And the Wi-Fi industry in the US has figured out a way to coexist. And that would sort of fundamentally change if mobile was introduced. Maybe we'll expand beyond the US and we'll look south to Latin America. Right after the US decided to make 6 gigahertz unlicensed, quite a few South American countries followed. But in recent years, quite a few of them have reversed their decision. So Chile and Brazil have both reversed their decision. What do you make of that reversal, and why do you think that happened?
The The Brazil reversal in particular is an interesting one because Brazil is still authorizing 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi equipment. So even though I think certainly the public position is to take back that allocation, in practice, Wi-Fi gear is still being authorized in the band. Second, and this is maybe a broader point even than just, in fact, I know it certainly is a broader point than just Brazil, but mobile operators are not ready to move into the 6 gigahertz band for a lot of reasons. One, there is no 5G, 6G technology that operates in 6 gigahertz. Yes, we've seen, proof of concepts or demos, trials, things like that, but there is no ecosystem. And frankly, that industry faces challenges with even developing an ecosystem there because of the fragmented nature, right? Not achieving the levels of scale that would be necessary to really make that band viable for IMT or cellular to move into. And so for that reason, as well as just very practical business reasons where operators are in no position to purchase, particularly at the price levels that these governments are hoping to auction the spectrum at, they're not ready to make those investments. They don't need the spectrum immediately. Certainly, they aren't seeing the level of growth in terms of mobile revenues that maybe they'd hoped to see with 5G. And are they really ready to make this huge investment in more spectrum? And I think what happened in Hong Kong is very illustrative of this. And Richard, I know you covered this after the auctions in Hong Kong. I want to say they only actually auctioned off 75% of the spectrum that was available and only got like 5% above the reserve price. So I think that's one very clear example. And I think some of those same dynamics are playing out in countries like Brazil, where their operators, yes, in a way, they almost want it reserved, like set aside where no one else moves in, but we don't want it yet, right? And that's kind of a very interesting position to be in, whereas the Wi-Fi industry is ready. We are shipping products today. We are going to make use of it. So, we'll see ultimately what happens. I think Europe and what happens in Europe is going to have significant impacts on the rest of the world in Africa, maybe pushing one direction or another, what's happening in South America, in terms of influencing that. Because of that commonality, and the more we have harmonization across the globe, that just makes everything more cost effective. It creates those economies of scale. And ultimately, that's why we think Europe is actually going to be the decisions there will be pivotal, very pivotal.
Mm. Yeah, I take the point about mobile 6 gigahertz equipment being, not being there yet. But why is it then that Brazil would say, look, never mind the Wi-Fi strategy? Also, could you explain what they're doing exactly if they're still approving Wi-Fi equipment? What is their actual policy on 6 gigahertz right now in Brazil?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think, frankly, the Brazilian administration would have to probably answer that question. Their public statements are all certainly we have to go with, to go on, which are that they are looking at reallocating the upper part of the band for IMT, but we're in this interesting kind of no man's land of they have not fully moved forward with that, but they also haven't fully foreclosed on Wi-Fi being in the band. And we certainly know that there are groups in Brazil, particularly around the ISP community, so non-mobile, more fixed ISPs, who have been so an organization called Abrint, which has been very vocal in their need for unlicensed spectrum to serve the Brazilian population. Brazil's interesting in just the sheer number of service providers. I want to say it's over 20,000 service providers in Brazil. So it's a very fragmented, very much like village by village, many service providers in a given city. And they rely heavily on unlicensed spectrum. So I think we're just a little bit in this no man's land, as I said, of not going one direction or another. And maybe what happens and develops in Europe could have an impact long term on what Brazil ultimately decides to do.
Well, maybe we'll continue the 6 gigahertz world tour and sail over to Europe. What's the Wi-Fi Alliance's sort of take on the hybrid strategy. So I guess for our listeners in Europe, they're considering if it's possible to somehow complement both IMT and Wi-Fi or unlicensed in upper 6 gigahertz. What's your sort of big picture perspective on that strategy?
Yeah, so big picture, I want to say there's 5 different proposals. And for the purpose of this, the conversation we'll focus on, I think, is proposal 1 and 5, which is proposal 1 is the optimal one from the Wi-Fi industry's perspective, which is allocate the entire 1200 megahertz to Wi-Fi, right? So that's the same. It would align it with the United States, South Korea, others who have other major economies who have chosen that route. Now, the 5th option is this hybrid approach that you mentioned, Richard, which is it's a prioritized split. This is something that the Wi-Fi industry can get behind. We don't think it's optimal, but we can get behind it. We can support it, help develop the regulations, and ultimately develop product that will take advantage of that type of regulatory framework. And part of the reason why we can get behind it is it's a prioritized split. So this gets a bit confusing. You have the lower part of the band, right? And then you have the upper part of the band. And in this prioritized split, you have the upper and the lower upper, right? So that upper part is kind of split. And the debate is kind of where to draw that line. The Wi-Fi industry would like to see an additional 320 megahertz being prioritized for Wi-Fi. And the idea would be Wi-Fi can operate in the portion of the band where it is not the priority, meaning the upper, so long as IMT is not using it. So what this means is users, businesses get the full benefit of the 6 gigahertz band immediately because we can move in very quickly. Again, the devices shipping to Europe already have the capabilities to operate in the upper part of the band. It's just disabled. Right, so it's a very simple approach to just turn that on, give people the full benefit of the things they already purchased. They already paid for these capabilities. They're just not. It's turned off right now. So we can move in very quickly and deliver those benefits immediately. And then there would be a mechanism where essentially if IMT moves into the upper part of the band in a particular location, it would signal to Wi-Fi that it is in the band, and Wi-Fi networks would vacate those channels where IMT is operating. That's the approach. Now, here's what I think the reality is going to be. It is going to take a decade or more for IMT to if it ever moves into the upper part of the band, it's going to take a significant amount of time. There are those same incumbent challenges that we talked about earlier exist in the 6 gigahertz band in Europe, and probably even more challenging in Europe. And what also makes it more challenging is you have each of the national governments who are going to make decisions on how to allocate spectrum. Research has already been done. It's shown that IMT cannot coexist with the incumbents in the upper part of the band, so you've got to clear the band. That may only happen on a country by country basis. You may still have allocations for the upper part of the band to Wi-Fi in some countries. So you're going to have an incredibly fragmented market, which goes very much against all these ideas around a single market in Europe. So while all of that plays out, the best course of action is to let Wi-Fi deliver benefits today while that gets figured out, if it ever gets figured out. And so that's why we can certainly support that hybrid approach. Obviously, Ofcom kind of put this out there first. We're now seeing similar traction in RSPG for the rest of Europe, and that's something we're very eager to help move through if they ultimately decide not to allocate the full band.
Mm-hmm. And you sort of alluded to this earlier. If this strategy were to be adopted, could it be helpful for some of those other countries like Brazil that are wavering a little bit and sort of not sure what their own 6 gigahertz policy is? Could it sort of be a helpful resource to have the sharing mechanism for them as well?
No, it absolutely is. And this is one of the things, and another similar area with this is standard power 6 gigahertz, which uses automated frequency coordination. And what we have found and I'll just use that as an example, the more commonality you have, the better. It simplifies vendors who have to go through the type approval process for each country. It simplifies their product development. They don't have to have a whole bunch of different SKUs for different countries. It addresses a lot of the challenges you would see, which, by the way, kind of going back to U.S. and, for example, Mexico, you have huge population, individuals who live in Mexico, come up to the U.S. to work, vice versa. So in Europe is an exactly similar situation, right? Where you have people and equipment crossing borders, and this makes it so difficult. So the more that we have commonality, the better. And you're absolutely right. I think as we start to see maybe settling on one or two approaches, so the U.S. a full allocation, Europe maybe this hybrid split with the prioritization in each part of the band, I think most of the world will then fall in line in one of those two camps based on what works best for them, right? But you certainly don't want to have 5 solutions, 6, 7. That's just going to slow everything down.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess we'll continue our Wi-Fi world tour and go further east. There's a little bit of a sort of surge in interest in having IMT in Upper 6 in Southeast Asia. Obviously, Hong Kong, as you said, auctioned it. There's a few other countries that have it on their roadmap: Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Thailand, Bangladesh, Cambodia. It's quite noticeable that there's this concentration in Southeast Asia where there is an interest in having IMT in this band. What do you think the reason for that is?
I think certainly part of that is because another country that you didn't mention is China, which has been very obviously very clear in its desire to use the band for license for IMT. And so I think what you see there is it's a very simple explanation. It's that region, a major player in that region may be going the IMT route, and that's creating, that is influencing what other countries in the region might do, often buying from similar suppliers, et cetera, right? So I think that's part of what you see. But a lot of that, I think, can change. Using an example of Thailand, Wi-Fi Alliance just recently did a trial that was in Thailand in Ramathapudi Hospital, which is a teaching hospital just outside Bangkok. And the regulator there wanted to see, okay, what are the benefits of the upper 6 gigahertz part of the band? And this was with, actually during the semester, this was with medical student, young medical students doing kind of intro to anatomy, et cetera, which traditionally would be taught on cadavers, which, that's a limited resource. And it's also challenging just to get people around a cadaver. So what they're innovating is using VR, actually to learn this anatomy, where you can peel away pieces of the body, et cetera, virtually. And we did this demonstration, this trial over a semester. It showed that the upper part of the band gets us twice the throughput, which you'd expect, a 5x improvement in latency. And then we also did more of like a qualitative, where each of the medical students kind of rated the experience between the two scenarios. And it was a 3x improvement in this qualitative measure of their satisfaction with it. So while you're absolutely right that some of these countries are kind of looking and evaluating and might be appearing to lean towards IMT in the upper part of the band, I still think there is interest from many of these regulators in really doing the work and diligence of understanding, okay, what are the trade-offs and what are the types of things we can deliver using unlicensed versus IMT.
In other words, you shouldn't give up on Southeast Asia just yet.
No, absolutely not. I think ultimately we'll see where it goes, but I don't think we're really writing off any region right now. I think we feel very good with the real world benefits the Wi-Fi delivers, and ultimately that's going to prove out in the market, and people are going to see it in other regions. And I think that's the other thing that starts to influence is when you see what might be happening in Europe, even Brazil over time. It's people are going to see the benefits. So now it's no longer an academic argument. They're actually seeing what is happening. Almost think of it as like different laboratories, right? They're going to see what's happening in these different countries, and that can influence policy.
I think that concludes our world tour of 6 gigahertz. Is there any countries I missed or any sort of policy developments?
There's plenty of countries we probably missed. Right?
Yeah.
But no, I think we hit the major regions. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate that. And it's good to have an overview of 6 gigahertz. I think it's been 5 years since the FCC's decision. So nearly half a decade on.
I know it feels like yesterday, but yes, it's been a number of years, and but we're seeing a lot of traction. I think this year we're expected to ship roughly 500 million Wi-Fi 7 devices. As I said, the current generation of Wi-Fi relies on 6 gigahertz. It's kind of baked into it, if you will. And it's one of the things I think we're really trying to hit on is, and I know, Richard, we've been talking more like on the spectrum policy piece, but what often gets missed by policymakers is the broader policy implications of these decisions. For example, like we didn't touch on sustainability. Like if you look at in Europe and what they want to achieve in terms of energy efficiency and sustainability, the play for that is pretty simple. It's fiber plus Wi-Fi, right? We did some research that was showing, what is the impact of trying to deliver indoor connectivity from a base station that is outdoors. And it's significant impacts. I want to say it's like 30 megatons or something like that of CO2 difference in trying to do that from a base station. But that's a policy. A lot of people don't think of spectrum having an impact on a sustainability policy. They often don't necessarily think about Wi-Fi in conversations around global competitiveness, or we already talked about the one market, single market policy. So all of those things have these little kind of these little veins that go into spectrum and connectivity policy. And so we're trying to do a much better job of helping people to understand that. But it's obviously very, very important to us. And I think it's important to everyone around the world that relies on Wi-Fi every day.
Well, thanks, Kevin. I appreciate you coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here, Richard.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you enjoyed it, I encourage you to subscribe. The Policy Tracker Spectrum podcast is available on all major platforms. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.